previous topic, we looked at the simple Ricardian model of trade, which is the sort of the one that most trade courses sort of first look at. But as we're going to see, although it has some really important insights into it, it does have some fairly sort of glaring issues, if you like, in relation to things like the distribution of income. This topic this week is what we call the specific factors model, and is a good model, and sort of you can see how we're starting to move away from the relative simplicity of the Ricardian model. But actually, in many respects, the more important issue is that it's a good way of setting up the model that we're going to look at next, the Heckscher-Ohlin model. And so bear that in mind when we're doing it, that we're going to use this as a stepping stone as much as anything, but it's got some really important insights into a trade that we want to address. So again, if you remember back to the Ricardian model, we only had one factor of production, and that was labour, and one of the important consequences, if you like, of that model is that because we've only got the one factor of production and the country gains from trade, the implication here is that all individuals gain from trade. In other words, everybody is better off from trade in a Ricardian model. But this is far too simple. Okay, even if trade in the aggregate makes society better off, and that's going to be true, we need a more realistic model because, of course, not everyone in society is going to be a winner. It actually can make some people, particularly in the short term, worse off. And this is an important aspect, particularly today, that we need to consider. In other words, trade can alter the distribution of income and creates both winners and losers. So this simple model that we're going to look at here, this specific factor model, starts to look at additional factors of production. Basically then, once we've done this, we're going to, in subsequent weeks, we're going to change some of the assumptions of this model and start looking at other issues as well. So the assumptions of this model are, at the moment, again, we're going to look at this without trade. And then clearly in subsequent videos, we're going to introduce trade, international trade. So we've got one country. We've got two goods, and we'll just call them cloth and food. And it's different from the previous examples, products, but it really makes no odds. You can call them whatever you want. But now this is I guess the important bit, which distinguishes it from certainly the Ricardian model anyway, is that sure, we've still got labour, and the labour is used in both sectors. In other words, in the production of both cloth and food. And so we have little subscripts to that, labour used for cloth and the labour used for food. Then we've got, and hence the name, the specific factor model, we've got there are other factors of production that are specific to the production of each good. So you can see here we're assuming that we've got capital, but that is only used in the production of cloth. And we've also got land, which is only used in the production of food. And they're denoted K and T respectively. So if we want to have a look at a production function for each, we've got the production function of cloth, which is a function of capital, remember, and the labour devoted to employed in cloth. And we've got the production function of food, which is a function of the land, which is specific to that factor, and the labour force used in food. Obviously then, the combination or the sum of the labour used for both cloth and food is equal to the aggregate labour available to this economy. So in order to understand this, we're actually going to take a few steps back almost to first year, if you like, and we're going to we need to understand or recap the law of diminishing marginal returns, because we're going to use the marginal product of the variable factor quite a bit in this topic. So on the left-hand side, what I've got is a production function. On the right-hand side, we're going to look at how that translates, if you like, into the marginal product of labour. Remember that that labour can move between sectors, and only labour can move between sectors. So that's the one we're going to focus on initially. So you can see here on the left-hand diagram, we've got the quantity of cloth, and we've got the labour of cloth. So this is where we're going to have the production function, and again labour and the marginal product. So here you can see sort of a fairly general production function. You can see though the slope of this is the marginal product of labour. So again, this is a first year, second year kind of concept where the rate of change in the production function is the marginal product of labour. So you can see that in the terms of the production function, that slope, of course, is changing all the time. Starts off steep, but then gets flatter and flatter and flatter. In other words, the marginal product starts off high when you're not using much labour for cloth, and declines as you use more and more labour. We don't worry about increasing and then diminishing marginal returns. You can see from the shape of the production function that we're just assuming that slope is getting flatter and flatter straight away. So we're just assuming diminishing return sets in pretty much essentially straight away. Yeah. Remember, we're also holding, at this stage, we're holding capital constant, right? So again, remember, marginal product is kind of a short run thing. So we're holding one of the factors constant, capital, and we're allowing labour to vary, yeah, which is what gives us that diminishing marginal returns. Now, of course, we can, but I'm not going to do the same thing for food. But of course, then we'd be holding land constant. That's our fixed factor of production, and we could allow the quantity of labour to vary in food. Now, this is kind of an annoying diagram. You're going to hate this one, but again, it allows us to do these things, to look at the whole thing, if you like, without having to resort to 2, 3, or 4 diagrams. A quick sort of explanation before I show you what's going on here. So this, in the top right-hand quadrant, if you like, we've got the quantity of food being produced, the quantity of cloth being produced. Ultimately, what we're going to derive here is a production possibility curve, showing the combinations of food and cloth that we can make. Here, if you like, at the bottom left quadrant, we've got the quantity of labour being used for cloth, and of course the quantity of labour being used for food. That makes the other 2 quadrants in the top left and the bottom right sections. That's the relationship between how the quantity of food, for example, varies as you change the amount of labour devoted to food. And in this one here, we show how the quantity of cloth changes as you change the amount of labour that you use for cloth. And we're going to bring them all together to show how we ultimately, in this top right-hand quadrant, derive the production possibility frontier. So, first step, we're going to look at our allocation of labour between food and cloth. Now, this is linear. You take an hour of labour out of cloth, and you put an hour of labour into food, or vice versa. So it's a constant slope, straight line, linear, and so that's fine. Okay, so this is just simply a substitution between cloth and food in terms of the labour being used. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to pick a couple of points and develop how this works. So I'm just randomly sort of picking this point A here. So you can see this here, or this distance here, is the quantity or the amount of labour being used in food. And this distance here, this quantity here, is the amount of labour being used for cloth. You can see that then translates here and here into a quantity of food and cloth that can be produced. So in other words, given that we're using this much labour in the production of food, we can produce that quantity of food. Yeah? And given that we're using this quantity of labour for cloth, we can produce this quantity of cloth. Bringing that across, we can see how that then translates into, we've got that quantity of food and that quantity of cloth. That gives us 1 point on our production possibility curve. And simply all we need to do then is do that. I'm just going to pick another couple of points just to sort of reinforce this. If we use, obviously if we're using here less labour for food, we're going to produce less food. Here though, of course, if we're using less labour for food, we are obviously using more labour for cloth, and so the production of cloth is going to rise. So again, Mapping those 2 points where we've got the quantity of food and the quantity of cloth, that's another point on our production possibility frontier. And then just once more, just for fun, pick point here. See, again, we're moving in this direction down the labour possibility curve. It's not actually a name, but let's call it that. Where again, we're using even less labour for food and more labour for cloth. That maps into another point in terms of our production function. And then simply, I'm just going to join the dots on these to sort of highlight what we're talking about. So there's our production function. I had the same thing on the previous slide when we were looking at how, what was the example? It was cloth, I think I was using, wasn't it? How, as you vary the amount of labour, the amount of cloth that you can produce changes as well. So that's that one for food. And again, you know, this can be translated into that for cloth. So we've got our 2 production functions that should be showing diminishing returns, but my drawing's kind of pretty average. It sort of does. Yeah, it sort of does. So there's our 2 production functions in the top left and the bottom right quadrants. And so obviously the only thing that remains is to then join the dots for our production function. Our production possibility frontier. So that's how we go from changing the amount of labour here, ultimately into how the production possibility frontier is created. Now, I guess one thing to note, even though this is linear in terms of the labour, it's what one unit out, 1 unit in to the 2 sectors. The production possibility frontier is obviously going to be non-linear because of this idea of diminishing returns. So you're not getting the same output when you have an extra unit of labour put into, say, cloth and away from food. That's going to change the marginal products. In other words, that worker is going to start to, the more and more you put into a sector, the more and more labour you put into a sector, the less and less, if you like, extra output that person or that hour is going to create. So that's what gives this production possibility frontier. Again, it's pretty ugly. That's my drawing. It's non-linear function, form, shape, whatever. Other things to note here. Okay, so again, the slope of the individual production functions, that was the quadrants in the top left and the bottom right, is again the slope is the marginal product of labour, again depending on which quadrant, food or cloth. And remember, it represents the additional output from 1 unit of labour, 1 hour of labour in that sector. So in other words, 1 additional unit of cloth would take 1 over the marginal product hours of labour. At the same time, 1 additional labour hour of cloth would require 1 less in food, which of course, when you take away that, say, hour of labour in food, you're going to reduce output by the quantity that that person would have produced. And so that, of course, is equal to the marginal product of labour in food, and it's negative. You're decreasing output. So in other words then, going from the individual quadrants of the production functions, that means that the slope of the production possibility frontier is going to be the ratio of the 2 marginal productivities. Okay, so we've outlined what's possible in terms of production between the 2 sectors, but we obviously want to know what they're actually going to produce. Remember, we're still not talking about trade yet, we're just simply talking about within an individual country. But in order to find out what they're actually going to produce and therefore how much labour is going to be used in each sector, we have to introduce prices, and as a result of that, obviously, we can then talk about the wage rate in the 2 sectors. Now, we've looked at this a little bit before, but let's go back to the demand for labour. So firms, of course, are going to demand labour up to the point where the cost of that labour is equal to the revenue that they bring in, that person or that hour of labour earns on that. So for cloth, for example, we can obviously do the same thing for food. It's the marginal product, how many units of cloth the last worker produces, multiplied by the price of that cloth will give you the wage. Yep, so there's the unit of good produced from 1 hour of labour, there's the price. So this collectively, that MPL multiplied by the price, is obviously the revenue earned from 1 labour hour of cloth. and that's going to be equal to the wage paid. Now, of course, because remember, and I haven't got a natty little graphic for this, but remember, we've got diminishing marginal returns, right? So the marginal product of labour is declining, it's falling. So that means, of course, that the demand for labour curve is also falling. So here you can see, again, I've got a sort of a weird diagram, but it's for a purpose. I've got on the right-hand axis, vertical axis, I've got the marginal product of food, marginal product of labour, sorry, in terms of food production, which is equal to the wage paid to labour. And so we're starting at 0 here, and as you move to the left, that's an increase in the labour used in food. And then on the left-hand side, same thing for cloth, okay? And so as you move in this direction to the right, you're using more labour for the production of cloth. So in that sense, remember, we're going to have this downward sloping labour demand curve, which remember is just the price multiplied by the marginal product. And we can do the same thing in terms of food, but of course, remember, we're going in the opposite direction here, so it's going to look like that. Again, the marginal product declines as you use more and more labour. The intersection of these, in terms of the two sectors, in terms of labour in the two sectors, is going to be equal to the wage, equilibrium, if you like, wage. So that's where the price multiplied by the marginal product of labour in the cloth sector is equal to the price of food multiplied by the marginal product of labour for food, which is equal to the wage. At this point here, that means that we're going to be using this much this much labour in cloth and this much labour in the production of food. In equilibrium, therefore, we've got this condition. Okay, so price times the marginal product of labour for cloth is equal to the price of food multiplied by the marginal product of labour for food. We can rearrange this and get these ratios. So in other words, the slope of the production possibility frontier, that's the left-hand side there, is equal to the ratio of the prices. And we can do this on a diagram very simply now that we've got, remember, we're going to be looking at our production function. We've got the quantity of food and the quantity of cloth. So the production function is going to look something like that. In terms of the ratio of the prices, what we're looking for, therefore, is when the slope of the two are the same. In other words, the slope of the production function is equal to the slope of the relative price ratio. So in terms of this, then, we now know what this country is going to produce in terms of the amount of food, Q1F, and the amount of cloth, Q1C. Now, having established that, of course, that again, remember, that's just for one country. We're obviously going to, in subsequent videos, we're going to look at the issue of prices and how changes in the relative prices will affect the change in the production of the two goods in the two sectors. And then, of course, we're going to expand that to start looking at trade and then international trade, and then look at the consequences of that.